So thank you everyone for having us here and joining our talk, You've Got Mail. My name is Dan Caban. I'm a principal consultant delivering incident response consulting based in the Middle East. I'm based out of Dubai. I'm actually a Canadian working in the Middle East. I've been doing incident response or digital forensics for going on 14 years now, but the last 4 years have been at Mandiant based in the Dubai office.
And hi, so my name is Mux Irani. I'm a technical director for incident response. And like Dan, I'm based out of Dubai, so I cover the Middle East and Africa. So I was originally from the UK. I now work in the Middle East. Been with Mandiant for 5.5 years. And prior to working for Mandiant, I used to work for the UK government doing security.
So Ian laid out kind of what we're going to talk about. It's email, infrastructure compromise, exchange specifically in the enterprise. We've broken it up into these kind of categories: getting access, the initial phishing, second factor authentication and the bypasses we've seen, attacking the client, and finally we're going to go into web shells, IAS modules, and transport handlers and how we see exchange servers compromised in real-world engagements. And we'll close it off with some examples of how PowerShell, the Exchange Control Panel, and EWS can be leveraged as well by threat actors post-exploitation. Now, most people, when they think I'm here to talk about You've Got Mail, they think AOL, they think old school, but actually I'm a romantic at heart. This is inspired by Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan's You've Got Mail film from 1998.
So this was interesting because Dan said to me, AOL, you can get internet on a CD. I was mind blown. I didn't know that was actually a thing. But I think it's something really popular in the US 10 years ago.
So at Mandiant, we use something called the attack lifecycle to help understand how threat actors work. We categorize their tools, their techniques, and procedures into these buckets to make them easy to digest and to understand where they are in the lifecycle of an attack. And typically when we talk about email infrastructure compromise, we immediately think about phishing, about the initial compromise, how they're getting into your organization. And earlier this morning, the keynote with Kevin Manda, he talked about 91% of our investigations are rooted or involve email compromise. But what you're going to see in this talk is that email actually, it's categorized into all the things. We see attackers establishing a foothold on email servers or using email-based backdoors. We see them escalating privileges, absolutely, by stealing credentials from Exchange servers, and even internal reconnaissance and lateral movement using web shells planted on Exchange servers. And of course, to accomplish their mission or complete their mission, it might be their motivation is espionage. Their motivation is just to read email. So it's an all-in-one location to complete the attack lifecycle.
So I'm going to talk to you about the first topic, which is getting access, and focus on social engineering. So over the sort of last few years, we've seen a particular interest, and phishing is still very popular because it's actually still incredibly effective. It's a really effective way to get the initial compromise in most organizations. And we've split this up into two buckets. I'm going to talk about sort of the low to medium successes. So what we've seen with low to medium successes, masquerading of domain names. So similar looking domain names. We've also seen global TLDs and international TLDs and things like internationalized domain names. So these are using Unicode. Now, Kevin mentioned in the morning, every day for us is a Monday, so we're working every day, and that results in me working next to my keyboard, eating my lunch on my keyboard, and evidently I get crumbs all over my screen. So I was analyzing some emails, and I had one of these international domain names come across, and I thought I was looking at some dust particle or some filth on my screen. But actually, it was A with a little caret on top. So I've been burnt by this, so either clean your screen or just pay attention to the Unicode in your domain names. And we've seen an increase in security alerts. So these are security alerts mimicking the likes of Google or Yahoo, saying that you've got an alert, please come, please click. So you expect to see these things, and users generally, if they see an alert, they'll click to see what's happening.
But the highest level of success for successfully compromising an organization is through the abuse of trust or the exploitation of human relationships. And this can be coming from a third-party vendor that's trusted, or it could be coming a phishing email coming internally. So this is a little visualization of how attackers are attacking our customers. We're becoming more and more mature and setting up our perimeter security to block attackers sending phishing emails. We're setting up turrets to prevent attackers, but the real threat is coming through the third-party service providers that give you services, products, licenses, and hardware. And this is the reality of our intrusions and what we're seeing in the real world.
So moving on to one of the threat groups that a lot of the case studies, a lot of the things we're talking about today are based on is APT34. APT34 are an Iranian cyber espionage group. We've been tracking them internally since 2014, and I think they came into sort of limelight in 2015. So in 2015, what happened was something known as PowBat. They were targeting financial institutions across the Middle East. And FireEye blogged about this, stating that this is occurring, and we're now seeing this particular group actually attacking these financial institutions. What I found very interesting is, in the next iteration of this group, we actually found them renaming the PowerShell files they use to FireEye.ps1. So that actually tells us that A, they read our blogs, B, they know that we're onto them, and C, they don't really care. They're kind of rubbing it in our faces. So APT34 are very much targeting the Middle East. They target multiple different industries. So they're not specific to an industry. They use a mixture of both public and private or non-public tools, but they love to conduct spear phishing activities, and they leverage social media for the initial reconnaissance or sort of targeting.
So one case study, an example of a typical scenario with APT34, specifically something we saw in 2015 when they started with PowBat, was they sent an email from a trusted third-party supplier. Because of that abuse of trust, the user enabled macros. They ran a sample that dropped PowBat, which resulted in the operator executing Mimikatz on the workstation of the impacted user. Ultimately, the threat actor moved laterally to the Exchange servers, where they again executed Mimikatz and dropped some web shells. So all of this attack was, fit into the lifecycle involving email infrastructure, and ultimately resulted in a compromise of the entire organization within 3 hours. We saw 3 hours later they were done. They packed up and came back the next day. Later, based on this scenario, we saw evidence of exfiltration of RAR and PNG files on, again, the Exchange server. They placed them there and downloaded them with a download manager. And we saw that based on the 206 status codes. Definitely some red flags from our investigation, but it was too late. It was already done. And there's no way a PNG image should be 4 gigabytes, so we knew something bad had happened. And with APT34 and many of our investigations, we warn our customers ahead of time that there's a high probability they're reading your email. And that's exactly what we saw in this case study as well, evidence of APT34 reading email. And this is an example of one of the kind of standard scenario phishing documents sent to our customers from APT34. There's an image at the top of the Excel document that encourages the user to enable macros and allow unsafe documents to be opened. And what's kind of neat about what APT34 started doing is, after macros were enabled, not only did PowBat get deployed, but the expected content was displayed in the Excel document. So they displayed what the user wanted, and there was nothing to be concerned about, no reason to go to security and report it. And lately, we've also seen, since we always encourage our customers in hardening or preparing for incident response or in remediation to enhance their PowerShell logging capabilities, we now see when they're deploying these maldocs, they're disabling PowerShell logging, so it makes our job harder. Another technique we've seen for reliable ammunition when phishing or wanting to target a third-party organization is to register a confusingly similar domain name, but instead of sending a phishing email from that confusingly similar domain name, harvesting any inbound communications. So the perfect example, and we've displayed on this screen, someone has gone to get an insurance quote, and they've given a business card. The third-party organization has taken that business card and sent an email with a quote, Excel document. It's perfectly legitimate. But because they made a typo, the threat actor is able to harvest that, weaponize it, and send it on. And that generates extremely high success ratios for getting access.
So one thing to note about this particular technique, it's a very long-term technique. where you'll have to register one of these domain names and sit on that domain name, catching all emails for weeks and months. But as soon as you get that email, you got a high likelihood of the sender actually clicking on the initial document.
Exactly.
So I'm going to talk to you about a case study. And the first case study was, it was a company within the UAE. They received a phishing email, very generic. It was a categorized phish, which means the domain was categorized, so that's how it passed all the security controls. So they got in, it went to a few victims. Those victims clicked on the link. It popped up a username and password field. A few users might have typed in their username and password, but in parallel, the security team already identified this email. So they went ahead and they ended up blocking all access to the IP and domains. They were able to reset the users who clicked on the link, so the username and passwords, and then they subsequently deleted all emails on the mailbox related to this particular event. And they did this within 5 minutes. So really impressive, and we were really surprised that within 5 minutes from seeing the email hit the mailbox, they were able to do this using the playbooks. At the same time, there was a few parallel streams. So whilst the SOC were implementing this, a C-level, which is currently sitting on a beach on vacation in a hotel, received the email. He clicked on the email, but he was actually on the hotel Wi-Fi, which meant that the security controls were not enabled for this machine. So he typed in his username, he typed in his password, it went to the attackers, they had the details with him. So what the attackers did was they logged in, and then from his inbox, so this is a C-level executive, they sent the same email to a distribution group internally. So this is a trusted link now. It's coming from a C-level to the distribution group, which was the whole company. So the entire organization received this from the C-level. The great news is it was, again, blocked, because everybody from within the organization, whoever clicked on those links, they were getting the pop-up saying, you know, this domain is malicious, it's been blocked. But oh, these employees were so dedicated. They were so dedicated that, oh, if our C-level is telling us to click on this email and put in our credentials, we have to. So they started to disconnect the wire, the LAN. They went on the guest Wi-Fi where there are no security controls. And they started to click and actually insert the credentials. And that's when we got the call in the Dubai office to say, we think we need some help, can you guys come in?
So I went on site to help them assess the scope of the intrusion and understand what happened. Clearly there were some security gaps here. Multi-factor authentication was not there. Their assets, when off-site, were able to connect to the internet without any security controls, so their blocking in the proxy didn't help them. And the impact was 12 gigabytes worth of email was gone over 3 days. So this is just one small case study in how the impact can really hit home. A second case study, again quite small, but this one involves our red team, where they had done a spear phishing campaign targeting a financial institution in the Middle East. And they were successful. They got a couple pieces of credentials, and both of them had a common theme. They were based off a welcome password. Now that seems strange, so our team looked at open source intelligence to see what other passwords they had for this financial organization. And again, this welcome theme was there. So the reality we were assuming is that IT was setting a default welcome password and clearly hadn't ticked the box to require that they change it upon first logon. So the reality was they also did not have two-factor authentication on their email. Big mistake. We took the gallery and we did a password spray with just one password based on the default welcome that we saw. And 848 accounts, or 18% of the organization, had the same password. And this spread over 8 different domains representing subsidiaries of this financial organization. And we scripted something together using EWS to automate theoretical data exfiltration. What impact could this have? And the result was over 22 million email objects were available to us, totaling nearly 5 terabytes of data, 4.8 terabytes of data. And that's without considering other Outlook 365 services like OneDrive or other remotely exposed services without multi-factor authentication. So two-factor authentication is the next phase of our talk. I mean, a lot of our customers now do have two-factor. They think they're ready for war. If something goes wrong, at least they can mitigate the damage. Someone's ready to respond. But we're going to talk about some implementation of two-factor authentication that weren't sufficient. There was problems that occurred. The first is SMS text-based one-time passwords. We saw a customer implement this on their VPN specifically, and this was an ongoing project. And like I said earlier, frequently when we're talking about cyber espionage or targeted threat actors, they're reading the email of the security team. They're preparing for new security implementations. So because this phone number was pulled out of Active Directory, and because it was based on a user group inside Active Directory, the attacker was able to set the privileges to a user, set a phone number to a phone number that they control, and start logging in to VPN with two-factor. So if you just click, here's an example of what they were doing. We asked the customer, we knew that their VPN was compromised, they were logging in from multiple accounts. Give me a list of all foreign phone numbers in Active Directory, because they are not expected. This customer was based in one country only. And we started seeing anomalies like Canada, like Germany, like France. And when I just typed those into Google, I saw there were all these free services for getting text messages. So the attacker, they could have had good OPSEC and tried to get a phone number inside the country of the target, but they took the lazy route because attackers are lazy, just like us.
We are, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you about a second investigation regarding two-factor. So in this investigation, we came into the investigation and this customer already had implemented MAC address whitelisting as the two-factor. It's a pretty weak 2FA, but it's still better than having nothing. So in this process, a customer or an employee would email the security team saying, this is my MAC address, can you please whitelist me, and I can access the VPN concentrator. So this was all done using the email. And the attackers were still getting access, and this organization couldn't figure out why. So they said, okay, we're going to also implement an actual 2FA. So they also set up another project to implement 2FA. So they were going to use RSA. There was a project ongoing, but what they didn't know was actually the attackers were also aware of these projects. So originally, the attackers were looking at those emails which had the whitelisting MAC addresses coming through, which meant that they were then just creating a VM. MAC addresses can be changed very easily, putting in the MAC address, and then connecting to the VPN. And then they noticed this brand new project. So as the customer were preparing, so were the attackers. They ended up reading the emails coming from the RSA account, which was sending the soft tokens. So what they were able to do in essence were just figure out the soft tokens, use the soft tokens, and they were actually, and we caught them using it on one of their own devices. They ended up, and we saw activity of them compromising a server. And all they did was they created a VM, they just active synced the whole account down. So they had access to a lot of emails. And finally, we saw them accessing the RSA Authentication Manager with credentials, which means that if they wanted to, they could have created a new seed as well.
Finally, not to pick on Duo, but there are many different types of two-factor authentication that you can use. One implementation is Duo, and it's quite clear in their frequently asked questions that it does secure you from Outlook web access, but there's many different protocols that can be used to access email. I talked about how we scripted EWS, which is Exchange Web Services. We use PowerShell as one example. So you can access the content of an email inbox without using the web portal. And if you're only securing the web portal, then other protocols like ActiveSync or EWS are wide open to the public, and probably your security team might not be aware. So, you know, as we said, there's always going to be a security gap, and attackers are going to look for it. And especially if they're already in your enterprise, they've been reading the email of security, they're going to be prepared for it. The next section is on attacking the client. So this could be a scenario where we want to plant a backdoor on a user's workstation or laptop where they have an email client. Or it could be even a scenario where you have the credentials of that user and you want to establish a foothold. So all you have is credentials, you have nothing malicious on the person's machine. One scenario that we've seen in the wild, and we've seen definitely talked about in red teams a lot publicly, is a tool called Ruler that can be used to leverage vulnerabilities and how Outlook synchronizes or allows for roaming configuration. So if you change something like a rule in your Outlook on your desktop, that rule is copied over to your laptop. Or if you want to change the home page of your Outlook inbox, that also can be synchronized. Now this has since been patched, but we continue to see it in the wild. We've seen an investigation in the Middle East where we had some pretty interesting findings.
So in the Middle East, we were working on an investigation, and we had our ADR solution in place, and we were seeing malicious beaconings, but we couldn't figure out how those beaconings were actually happening. All we used to see was something was dropped from Outlook. So we thought, a fish, straightforward. We looked through the mailboxes, we asked the customer to have a look at the emails, but we couldn't figure out how this particular beaconing occurred or how the tools were being dropped. So as we did further analysis, we ended up realizing that actually the home page on the Outlook settings were changed to go and pull this remote file to be executed locally. And as we started to see this, we started to see more and more systems actually beaconing out, which meant that on the outside, so outside of the organization, all the attacker would have to have done is maybe looked at all those gigs of dumps of username and passwords and iterated through the OA and found a valid login. Once you have a valid login, then you can just change the home page. As soon as the user comes up, they will execute any code given.
So just as a demo POC to show you what it actually looks like, you can change the home page by right-clicking on your inbox and going to properties and setting your home page. If you're patched, that won't roam to another profile. But the reality is if you set a proper scriptlet to download and to execute on that home page and you set it to a remote web page controlled by the attacker, you can do things like use certutil and live off the land to download and execute a second stage loader. Or in this example, we just set our scriptlet to run calc.exe. So just from credentials that maybe I found in a password dump, I was able to launch calc.exe without ever having an initial foothold on the user's workstation. And bam, that's it. It's obviously you would want something to run in the background, but it works.
So this was a very important technique because you don't need access to the actual environment.
But here's an example of when you do have access to the environment. It's post-exploitation. You want multiple backdoors, multiple ways to access the target's environment. You could plant something like an Outlook add-in. You want to extend Outlook. And we found something called Postal Book or Postal Door in our region. And this is a .NET plugin to Outlook. You wouldn't see it if you looked in the properties of your Outlook profile. But really, it has capabilities to download, upload, and execute code. It was even modular, so new plugins could be added to the Outlook add-in. And to hide it from the user, it created hidden folders and made rules to manipulate things so they wouldn't see both incoming and outgoing C2 communications. And this is what one of the Outlook C2 communications looked like. It was actually an image embedded inside a signature of outgoing emails to the attacker's C2 emails. This configuration was XOR encrypted. There was RSA encryption keys for back and forth. It would essentially send out a beacon using WMI to pull the information and particular registry parameters. And it would take that information, encrypt it, and essentially do a form of steganography by putting that encrypted data into chunks of the PNG image and putting it inside that email. And that image I've blown up just to show you that it does visually represent something, but it was quite small inside the signature. It probably wouldn't be noticed either. So for incoming C2, it had some complex logic to ensure it was getting the right C2. It had a function called isMailForMe, which is quite descriptive. Because it's .NET, we can just decompile it and read the source code. To validate it was coming from the right person, there was some validation checks on SMTP references, looking for a particular offset, and MD5 validation was done. And if there was an attachment to the email, and it happened to be PNG, then it would process it to look for the C2 command. Because the attacker, even for the inbound C2, wanted to do steganography and hide their true motivation. That was base64 embedded, attached attachments, and then it would decrypt, validate the header, extract the chunks, and decrypt the actual C2 command. So it's a pretty novel way to maintain persistence using an email client.
And this is a further evolution in some respects. So there's a particular backdoor, again, sitting on Exchange. So just to iterate, all these backdoors sit on the Exchange infrastructure. And it was a DLL backdoor, which is called Facade. And one of the key elements of this particular backdoor is it has all the key components. You can harvest emails, which you'd want to do. You can upload. You can download, you can even execute code, but as Dan mentioned in the previous backdoor, there was an image, and that image contained the data. So this time, what this particular backdoor does is, it actually creates an image, puts the image in a PDF, and then sends a PDF. So when you look at the PDF, oh, this is a PDF I'm seeing, is it malicious? Nope, there's nothing in there. And this is an example with it being highlighted. It's just a blank PDF. But within that PDF, there'll be a JPEG which will contain the data. And one of the interesting things about this very particular backdoor was the fact that it doesn't only target enterprise. So Microsoft Outlook is an enterprise client, but we also see this backdoor targeting Outlook Express, Thunderbird, and a particular client called The Bat, which is popular in sort of Europe and Eastern European regions. So web shells. Now, we see a lot of web shells, but we're going to specifically talk about web shells on Exchange. And the evolution of web shells as we've seen them as we've doing these investigations. So I'm showing you two examples of web shells. On my left, which is your right, you'll see a thick client, which means you have an application, you can click, and it'll execute code because you got a server and a client component, and you can do a lot of things. On my right, you'll see a very traditional web form where you'll load up, you'll fill in the parameters, and execute. Now, these have also been known as file managers, file browsers. Early on, these were actual things I would use to administer my own boxes because it's convenient. So why do attackers like Exchange? So on a default 2013 Exchange, there are a lot of files. So there's over 500 files, there's over 55 folders. It's a lot of places where you can hide. You have over 30 DLLs as part of a default installation. So what that means is when you're installing or when you're looking at Exchange, there's a lot of places you can hide. And does your email Exchange administrator actually know a lot about the dynamics of what should be in these places?
Another good point is that Exchange it's 100% uptime. Your business is supported by it. So it's a great place to ensure that you're always going to have remote access through a web shell. So in the beginning, we saw web shells, and this is dating back to the early days of incident response, where on Exchange servers, where they would just find a confusingly similar file name and drop a full-featured web shell. For an example, there's a file name called errorfe.aspx, which is legitimate. We'd frequently see attackers dropping erroree.aspx, because a web administrator might not notice that, and certainly when time stomping is involved, it would look like it was meant to be there. And of course, it would have remote code execution capabilities and some very obvious, start process capabilities. If you were scanning for it, there's a good chance you'd be able to detect it. Later, we saw them using new techniques to avoid detection, or at least to avoid web application firewalls from seeing what they're doing. Instead of naming parameters, like naming your post parameter being command, you could use offsets. And we saw attackers doing this by posting, instead of just command and maybe the argument to that command, posting hundreds of different variables to the server. And instead of relying on the name, it would rely on an offset of that array, and even doing math to find the particular offset. So this avoids detection, and it avoids the risk that another threat actor might take over and start using your web shell. One example, a recent technique we saw, is where a threat actor had also modified client-side JavaScript code on the Exchange server, flogon.js, and that JavaScript code was embedded at runtime into logon.aspx. So when you came to log into OA, you typed in your username and password, and you clicked the logon button. Instead of just posting your username and password to the logon page, it would send it to the log off page as well. And that log-off page would harvest your credentials and store them in a semi-encoded fashion into a legitimate file on the file system called ftp.ext.tlb. And that log-off page was legitimate but modified to harvest those credentials and also to pull them back out. So whenever the attacker wanted to get a fresh set of credentials, and we believe they scheduled this for the task every week, they would come, pull them back, and be happy.
I mean, this is a great technique, right? Because you're always going to get the most up-to-date credentials. So if you have an enterprise password reset, everyone's going to go, they're going to go log back in, and you're still going to get the valid credentials unless they've gone through the remediation correctly.
More recently, we've seen some cool techniques to avoid, scanning for web shells. Often when we're looking for web shells, we look for that start process technique. Even if you use offsets, you still need to start a process if you remote command execution. So instead, we've seen attackers using dynamic web shells, as I call them. So instead of having that functionality, all it does is accepts parameters. In this case, it was encrypted with RC4, accepts a post variable, which is the web shell source code. It compiles that source code, runs it in memory, and then will accept the post parameters. So it's near impossible to find this on a server by scanning for traditional strings you'd expect in a web shell. And thankfully, in this investigation, we were lucky and the cookies were available in the logs, so we were able to decrypt the source code and look at the source code of every single access of the web shell. And in this example here, we could find out actually what the attacker was trying to do, but based on the source code. And here they were dropping a PowerShell script in C perf logs, and that allowed us to scope our investigation and move forward.
So the next iteration was a web shell which was dynamic and also signed. So in the last few months, we come across a particular variant of a web shell which had a public key embedded, and the flow, it was using AES CBC 128. So it would accept, again, source code. It would then compile the source code and check whether it's been signed with a private key. And it uses the public key to verify this, which means that it will only ever execute the code if it's been signed. So what this stops is random people or random threat groups or other threat groups trying to hijack a particular web shell. And it's a pretty neat technique. It leaves very little evidence. So you have your typical upload, download commands, and when you're sort of looking at the flow of this, when the source code is sent, one of the things which we were really fortunate with was it left a GUID on the system, which meant that we knew something was executed, but we just didn't know exactly what the execution was.
So we're stepping out of web shells and talking now about IAS modules, handlers, and transport agents. So we saw an evolution of how they got better at web shells, better at evading detection, but the next level is to stop worrying about how you can modify scripts or plant scripts and start manipulating IAS itself. And this is all on Exchange servers, what we're going to talk about here. So some of this is quite obvious. If I was looking at logs or if I had a web application firewall, if a web shell was there and there was something as obvious as webshell.aspx, we're going to detect that. And we might detect a get string like command equals who am I, or a post variable like command equals who am I. What IIS modules allow you to do is to avoid detection. You can intercept requests, whether they be post or get, at a lower level. And in doing so, your logs are going to be suspiciously clean. In this case, I wrote actually an Apache module to do the same thing that we saw in Exchange. And the only indicator to tell something suspicious is happening is based on the byte size count. In fact, these logs just show me loading the home page, but I was uploading, downloading, and executing remote code. So if you want to extend IIS, you have multiple ways to do it. It's documented well on MSDN, and there's source code snippets. You can write your own modules to extend it easily. The two most common methods since IIS version 7 are using both managed and native modules. One is .NET source code. It runs at a lower level of privilege. And one is a C++ module that you can use to enhance your experience when deploying web applications. And we've seen attackers using both. The first example is a managed module, .NET source code, so we can just decompile it and see what its capabilities were. It was intercepting requests to a particular URI, auth.aspx, which is part of Exchange. You would expect it to be happening. And when that occurred, before the page was rendered, or before we got to the script layer, It would drop a source code of China Chopper, so a very small web shell that only interprets one parameter, drop it on disk, and essentially compile it and run it. So no modifications to scripts. This was just a DLL that was confusing as well. It was called Microsoft.exchange.clients.auth.dll. Seems like it belongs.
And one of the other modules we found was a native module. So we saw 2 DLLs being dropped, and this is an evolution or the upgrade of this particular backdoor. So the first iteration we saw was regparser.dll. So the reg session ID cookie contained base 64 data. You can execute, you can upload, you can download. These are the parameters which you would have to pass within the request. Now, as the intrusion continued over the years, we saw them upgrading the tools. So the next iteration was called HTTP module.dll. The improvements we saw were they actually changed the execute, upload, and download parameters to a more generic RC, UF, and DF, which means that most probably they've started to realize to do a bit more offset. But they've also changed the way on the validation, which means that the DLL itself was checking if the 25th header was actually default-Windows, which means that you'd need to know that this is how to this is how the DLL would process and validate the actual request.
So finally, we'll touch on transport agents, which if you were here early in the afternoon, our colleagues Matt and Adrian talked about an example they found dating back to 2010. We've seen more recent examples on email servers. And as they told you before, transport agents allow you to extend Exchange. Instead of extending IAS, you're down a little bit lower into the application layer. And a typical example might be if you wanted to install a product that allowed you to automate adding signatures to email. You know, you want to be in line of the email communication, whether they're being sent out or being received. What was found by Mandiant consultants was a malware called Xtrans, attributed to a nation-state threat actor, that had, of course, the typical capabilities we would expect. It was highly configurable in encrypted configuration files to allow you to have complex Boolean logic to determine what kind of attachments, subjects, and senders to target. And again, it used PDF and JPEG attachments for both inbound and outbound C2 communications. And typical remote code execution, of course, stealing email, stealing attachments, these are the capabilities of Xtrans. But what was unique about it is it also allowed for them to modify email, change the subject, change the body, or even block emails from being sent. So we're not just dealing with the confidentiality of your information, but also the integrity of it. So it's a pretty scary thought.
So our final topic for today is PowerShell, ECP, and EWS. And this is what we see a lot of usage in terms of financial threat groups. So if it's a business email compromise, we see a lot of usage of these sort of techniques. So the first technique I'm going to sort of talk about is forward SMTP address. It's very typical. It's a very easy thing to do. You can use PowerShell. You can forward all emails from a poor bloke. Bloke's a British term for person. And you forward it to, in this case, Dan Caban. So you can see how easy it is to implement. And underneath, this is a way to detect any forwarding rules on your exchange. But with forwarders, you're forwarding everything. You don't want everything. What you want is selected things and redirection. So what you're doing here is you're creating a new inbox rule, and you're using the rule, and then you're sort of looking at keywords. We saw this in a recent engagement with Business Email Compromise, where they created a hidden folder. They forwarded all emails to that hidden folder containing a certain keyword, which meant that when they sent out a lot of emails, every response went back into that particular hidden folder, so the user wouldn't know whether they're getting bounced or whether someone's replying to them.
Another common technique we've seen, I told you earlier, we see threat actors reading the email of security. They also sometimes will export an entire PSD of their target user. And Outlook or Microsoft gives Exchange administrators powerful tools with the right privileges to export from the Exchange database an entire PSD. And at one point when I was on site with a customer, We're doing our daily status report, reviewing our alerts for the day, and we found that his entire mailbox had been stolen. It had been written to a local file on the mail server, copied over to the Outlook web access portion of the web server, and downloaded, just like I told you earlier. It's pretty frightening. But probably the most interesting and shocking thing we've seen multiple times is the use of Exchange Control Panel and the functionality for e-discovery, or litigation holds. E-discovery being the boring side of digital forensics. We see them, so this allows you to put in litigation holds and to collect all emails across the Exchange enterprise and put them into a bucket, put them into an email account, essentially. When you download that email account, it has what you need. So if it was litigation, it might be related to a person or a product or a thing. But what we see attackers doing is more looking to collect credentials. E-discovery and Exchange, as I said, allows you to collect things. It puts them into a particular email account. In this case, the default for 2013 is this discovery search mailbox is where they end up. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you how you can also do it with PowerShell. You could do something very straightforward, like create a new mailbox search, a new e-discovery collection, and give it a name, like litigation holds, so it seems legitimate. Send that off to a target mailbox, a different one if you want to have full control, like exchange@malware.com, and set a specific search query. And this search query we've seen in multiple investigations. This is a copy and paste job, looking for VPN access and password. So looking for administrators sending VPN accounts to third-party users or internal users.
And we've also seen this at third-party suppliers, where if a certain supplier is servicing multiple customers, they'll be looking on their sort of inboxes to figure out what VPN accesses that supplier has to which customers. So then they can get a lot of access very quickly.
And you also get a nice little status email when it's done. And here's an example from a real case that we pulled off an Exchange server. The attacker had looked for VPN access and password, and the results were put into a PST container containing 701 megabytes worth of data, representing approximately 607 unique items. So immediately they have all this data that they can start working with. They've let Exchange do the hard work for them. They don't have to go hunting. It's ready for them to get started.
It's a win for them. So that is the conclusion of our presentation today. So just to sort of iterate that it's not just the initial compromise where you have to look at your email infrastructure. It highlights and it crosses across multiple different stages.
I hope we've communicated that to you quite clearly through these examples, because this doesn't stop. It's our day-to-day job dealing with Exchange infrastructure compromise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Much appreciated. If we have any questions, feel free to make your way to the mic. And in the meantime, I do have one for you. So in the States, we often see, particularly with our financial-based threat actors like Fin8, they'll call up the attended victim and say, hey, did you get that email I just sent about that order I placed? Oh, you didn't? Let me send it to your Gmail instead, and we'll go that way. Do you see that a lot internationally as well?
Absolutely. We've seen cases where to encourage the user to open the document, a phone call has been made, or even WhatsApp is quite popular in the Middle East. That's another medium you can use.
Sure.
And we've seen SMS, or one-time password, two-factor authentication bypasses done this way as well, where they call up the user and say, we need some validation, so please tell us what token code has just showed up on your phone.
Perfect. Excellent. It looks like we do have a question over here, and then we'll come over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so good talk. Thank you. Real quick, for organizations that have kind of left that admin of Exchange went to the cloud with, like, say, Office 365, what are some things they need to look for there, since they don't have full control over that infrastructure as it relates to, server-side things?
So I guess some of the prerequisites we talked about, like ensuring that you have multi-factor authentication, or still apply whether you're in the cloud or you're on-premise. Also prepare for the worst in terms of you're investigatively friendly in the cloud as well. Mailbox auditing, for example, is not on by default. So if an intrusion occurs, you won't be able to rely on the same log sources available on premises. So get a laundry list of how you need to be prepared before you migrate to the cloud.
Sir.
Legacy authentication. How often are you seeing attackers leverage legacy auth that might be still enabled while you're still trying to make the transition to modern authentication?
So I think it's, I don't know, it's either all or nothing. It seems like most of our customers are not meeting the minimum security requirements of having things like two-factor authentication, so it's simple. They can use whatever protocol is available. But I think the reality of disabling things like Exchange Web Services is near impossible, and ActiveSync, it may be possible, but the challenges there are different, I suppose.
And it's also worth noting the visibility. So if you know you have legacy infrastructure in place, which you can't, let's say, two-factor, it's good to know that you can't. A lot of our customers, they say we two-factor everything. We go into the investigation, and oh, nope, these few accounts, oh, we can't two-factor those. So it was a visibility problem, and if they can make that visible, at least they can put additional controls around those particular accounts.
Thank you for the question. Okay, so thank you, gentlemen, for the talk. It was excellent. Feel free to grab these guys later on here. They're going to be sticking around for the Oktoberfest party, so grab them if you have any further questions. In about 10 minutes at 4:35, we'll be doing our Carbon Act talk, which is going to be very nice. So please come here for that. It's one of my most anticipated talks. So we'll see you guys then.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.